Priscilla has continued to stain the name of this family.
There's a lie circulating right now about Graceland, and it's not the kind of lie you can just scroll past and forget. This one cuts deeper. This one erases a woman's entire childhood. This one rewrites history while the people who actually lived it are still here to tell you the truth. Donna Presley, niece of Elvis, granddaughter of Minnie May Presley, a woman who spent her formative years inside those mansion walls, has been told by someone from her past that she wasn't there a lot, that her memories don't count, that her testimony doesn't matter. Let that sink in for a second. A woman who spent every summer at Graceland from 1960 onward, who lived at Circle G Ranch with Elvis and the family between 1967 and 1969, whose parents stayed on the hill directly behind Graceland until 1985, whose grandmother lived inside the mansion until her death in 1980. This woman is being told she wasn't really there. The person making this claim? Danny Smith, someone who, like Donna, grew up around Graceland, someone who should know better, someone who apparently thinks proximity gives him the authority to erase someone else's lived experience. But here's where it gets worse. In the same breath that he dismisses Donna's presence, he throws out that tired, lazy line we've all heard 1,000 times. Elvis's drug habits speak for themselves. And that's the real story here, because what's happening to Donna Presley isn't just personal. It's a microcosm of what's been happening to Elvis's legacy for decades. The reduction, the oversimplification, the refusal to deal with medical reality because addiction makes a better headline. You want to know what really happened at Graceland. You want to know who was actually there, what Elvis was actually dealing with, and why this matters beyond just another family squabble on the internet. Then you need to hear this, all of it, because the truth isn't just different from what you've been told, it's the opposite. Let's start with the accusation itself. Wasn't there a lot? It sounds so casual, doesn't it? So dismissive. Like Donna was some distant relative who showed up for Christmas dinner once in a while and now claims she knew Elvis intimately. But that's not what happened. Donna Presley didn't visit Graceland. She lived in its orbit. From 1960 forward, every summer break, every school holiday, she was there, not in a hotel down the road, not staying with friends in Memphis. There, at Graceland, in the mansion, with the family. When the Presleys moved to Circle G Ranch, Elvis's sprawling estate where he kept horses and tried to find some semblance of normal family life away from the spotlight, Donna's family went too. For 2 full years, 1967 to 1969, they were part of the daily rhythm of Elvis's household. Breakfast, dinner, downtime, chaos, they lived it. And after that, they moved back to Memphis and settled on the hill directly behind Graceland. Not across town, not in another neighborhood. Behind Graceland. Her parents stayed there for 16 more years, until 1985, 5 years after Elvis died. 8 years after he was gone, her parents were still there. But sure, she wasn't there a lot. Here's what makes this even more insulting. Donna's grandmother, Minnie May Presley, known to the family as Grandma Dodger, lived inside the mansion, not in a guest house, not in staff quarters. Inside, she had her own room, and she stayed there until she died in 1980. Donna spent countless nights in that room, sleeping beside her grandmother, watching Elvis come in after long nights, exhausted, overwhelmed, looking for the one place in that massive house where he could just be Vernon's son and Gladys's boy, where he didn't have to be Elvis. He'd sit with Minnie May, talk, rest. Sometimes he'd just be quiet. Those moments weren't documented. They weren't photographed. They weren't turned into content for the fans. They were private. They were family, and Donna was there. She also slept in her parents' mobile home out back when the mansion got too crowded. She ate in the kitchen with the family. She sat in the den where everyone gathered. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't staff. She was family, and family doesn't clock in and out. So when Danny Smith says she wasn't there a lot, what he's really saying is, I didn't see her. And that's fine. Graceland was a mansion. It had space. It had privacy. People moved independently. You could be in the same house and not cross paths for days. But here's the thing that makes this claim even more ridiculous. Members of the Smith family, Danny's own family, spent years away from Graceland, working elsewhere, living elsewhere. That's been mentioned in public interviews. It's documented. It's their own record. So the person calling Donna absent is part of a family that was literally, physically absent for extended periods. And yet somehow, Donna, who never left, whose parents never left, whose grandmother died in that house, she's the one who wasn't there a lot. Do you see the problem yet? This isn't just about who was where and when. It's about who gets to tell the story. It's about whose memories count. And it's about what happens when people who were on the periphery try to rewrite the narrative to center themselves. But let's talk about the other part of this. The part that's even more damaging. The part that's haunted Elvis's legacy since the day he died. Elvis's drug habits speak for themselves. That line, that dismissive, reductive, medically ignorant line that people throw around like it's fact, like it's settled, like there's nothing more to say. Except there is, and what Donna Presley is about to tell you changes everything. Because what Elvis was dealing with wasn't addiction. It was something else entirely. Something that millions of people with chronic illness deal with every single day. Something that gets mislabeled, misunderstood, and turned into moral judgment instead of medical reality. So let's talk about what really happened behind those mansion walls. Let's talk about who was actually there. And let's talk about the medical truth they've been burying for decades. Because this isn't just Donna Presley defending her own memory. This is her defending Elvis, and it's about time someone did. You want to know what it means to be there? Let me tell you what Donna Presley's life actually looked like. 1960, she's a kid. And from that point forward, every single summer, every school break, every holiday, Graceland isn't where she visits, it's where she goes home. Not for a weekend, not for a photo opportunity, for months at a time, year after year. While other kids are at summer camp or staying with friends, Donna is at Graceland, living with her family, living with Elvis's family, because they're the same family. This isn't speculation. This isn't someone piecing together a timeline from old interviews and guessing. This is her life, her childhood, her adolescence, all of it orbiting around that mansion in Memphis. And then in 1967, something happens that changes everything. Elvis buys Circle G Ranch, a sprawling property where he can have horses, wide open space, some distance from the constant chaos of Graceland. He wants something that feels like normal family life, something that feels like home beyond the mansion that's become half museum, half fortress. And when Elvis and his family move to Circle G, Donna's family goes too. Not as employees, not as staff, as family. For 2 full years, 1967 to 1969, they lived there together. Daily life. Not the highlights, not the parties, the boring parts, the normal parts. Breakfast, dinner, watching TV. The rhythm of actual family existence that doesn't make it into the biographies or the documentaries. Elvis horseback riding in the morning. Elvis trying to fix something and getting frustrated. Elvis at the dinner table talking about whatever's on his mind. Not performing, not on, just existing. That's what Donna saw. That's what she lived for 2 years, every single day. And when that chapter closes and the family moves back to Memphis, where do they go? They settle on the hill directly behind Graceland. Not across town, not in a different neighborhood, behind the mansion, a stone's throw away. Her parents stay there until 1985. Let me say that again. 1985. Elvis dies in 1977. Her parents stay for 8 more years. They don't leave when the story ends. They don't pack up and move on. They stay because it's home. So when someone says Donna wasn't there a lot, what they're really revealing is their own limited perspective. What they saw, who they noticed, when they happened to be in the same room at the same time. But Graceland wasn't a studio apartment. It wasn't a small house where everyone's in each other's space all the time. It was a mansion, with wings, with separate areas, with private spaces. You could live there and not see someone for days, not because they weren't there, but because the house was big enough that people moved independently. You'd be in the kitchen and someone else would be upstairs. You'd be in the den and someone else would be in their room. You'd be outside and someone else would be in the back. That's not absence, that's just how large homes work. And here's the part that makes this whole thing even more significant. Donna's grandmother, Minnie May Presley, known to everyone as Grandma Dodger, lived inside the mansion. Not in a guest room, not temporarily. She had her own space, her own room, and she stayed there until she died in 1980. 3 years after Elvis, 3 years after the man who made that house famous was gone, Minnie May was still there, because Graceland wasn't just Elvis's house. It was a family home, and she was family. Donna spent huge portions of her life in that room with her grandmother. Sometimes she'd sleep there. Sometimes she'd just sit and talk. Sometimes she'd be there when Elvis came in. And he came in often. Because here's what people don't understand about Elvis in those later years. The mansion was full of people, staff, security, hangers-on, people who wanted something from him. People who saw him as Elvis Presley, the icon, the brand, the commodity. But when he went to Grandma's room, he wasn't that. He was just Vernon's boy, Gladys's son, the kid who grew up poor in Tupelo and never forgot where he came from. He'd come in to talk, to rest, to sit in silence, to be around someone who remembered him before any of this happened, before the fame, before the pressure, before everything got so complicated. And Donna was there, not every time, but enough times, enough to see him as a person, enough to understand that the man the world saw and the man her family knew were two very different people. Those memories aren't stories someone told her later. They're not pieced together from other people's accounts. They're hers, she lived them. She also spent time in her parents' mobile home out back when the mansion got too crowded or too chaotic. She ate meals in the kitchen where the family gathered. She sat in the den during those long evenings when everyone would wind down after the day. These aren't glamorous details. They're not the kind of thing that makes it into the movies or the tabloids, but they're real, and they're hers. So when Danny Smith, someone who should know all of this, someone who grew up in the same orbit, says she wasn't there a lot, he's not making a factual claim. He's revealing a blind spot. Because here's what's been mentioned in public interviews, in documented record. Members of the Smith family spent years away from Graceland, working elsewhere, living elsewhere. That's not a secret. That's not an insult. That's just what happened. People have jobs. People have lives outside of one location. That's fine. That's normal. But you don't get to be the person who was physically absent for work and then turn around and tell someone who never left that they weren't there a lot. That's not just inaccurate, that's audacious. Donna's parents stayed until 1985. Her grandmother died in that house in 1980. Donna spent her summers, her school breaks, her formative years inside those walls and on that property. But she wasn't visible to Danny Smith at every moment, so in his mind, she wasn't there. And that's the problem, not what happened, but who gets to decide what happened, whose memory counts, whose testimony matters. Donna Presley was there, not as a visitor, not as a fan, not as someone trying to get close to Elvis for the story. She was there as family, and that's a reality that no one, no matter how much they want to rewrite it, gets to take away from her. Now let's talk about the other claim, the one that's even more damaging, the one that's been repeated so many times it's become accepted as fact. Elvis's drug habits speak for themselves. That line, that lazy, reductive, medically illiterate line that people have been using to summarize Elvis Presley's final years for nearly 5 decades. It sounds definitive, doesn't it? Like there's nothing more to say, like the case is closed. Elvis was an addict, end of story. Except it's not the end of the story. It's not even the right story. Because what Elvis was dealing with, what killed him, what made his final years so difficult, wasn't addiction. Not in the clinical sense. Not in the way that word is actually defined by medical professionals. And the fact that we've spent half a century mislabeling it, misunderstanding it, and turning it into moral judgment instead of medical reality, that's not just wrong. That's cruel. So let me break this down, because there's a distinction here that matters, a distinction that changes everything. Addiction and dependency are not the same thing. They're not interchangeable terms. They're not different words for the same condition. They are clinically distinct diagnoses with different causes, different mechanisms, and different implications. The American Psychiatric Association, the organization that literally sets the diagnostic standards for mental health and substance use disorders, makes this clear. Addiction is defined by compulsive behavior, by destructive patterns driven by psychological craving and loss of control. It's characterized by seeking the substance despite negative consequences, despite harm to yourself and others, despite knowing it's destroying your life. It's the person who loses their job, their family, their home, and still can't stop. The person who lies, steals, manipulates to get what they need. The person whose entire existence becomes about chasing the next high. That's addiction. That's the clinical definition. Dependency is something else entirely. Dependency happens when your body develops a physiological reliance on a substance through long-term medical treatment. It happens when you're taking medication as prescribed, or close to it, for legitimate medical conditions, and over time, your body builds tolerance. You need more to achieve the same effect, not because you're chasing a high, but because your body has adapted, because the pain is still there, because the condition being treated hasn't gone away. This happens to cancer patients. It happens to people with chronic pain conditions. It happens to people with severe insomnia, hypertension, autoimmune disorders, any condition that requires long-term pharmaceutical management. And it happened to Elvis. Elvis wasn't hunting down street drugs. He wasn't meeting dealers in parking lots. He wasn't doctor shopping across state lines to feed a psychological addiction. He was under continuous medical supervision. He had attending physicians managing his care. He had documented chronic health conditions that required treatment. Severe insomnia, the kind where you can't shut your brain off, where you're exhausted but can't sleep, where days blur together because your body won't do the one thing it's supposed to do naturally. Hypertension, high blood pressure that puts you at risk for stroke, heart attack, organ damage, the kind of condition that requires medication and monitoring. Chronic pain from years of performing, from injuries that never fully healed, from a body that was pushed to its limits for decades and finally started breaking down. These weren't made-up conditions. These weren't excuses. These were real, documented medical issues that required pharmaceutical intervention. And yes, Elvis sometimes took more than was prescribed. That's true, that's not denied. But let me ask you something. Do you know what that's called in patients with chronic conditions? It's called tolerance escalation. It's called breakthrough pain. It's called the reality of long-term pharmaceutical dependency. When you've been on medication for years, your body adapts. The dose that worked 6 months ago doesn't work anymore. The pain breaks through. The insomnia comes back, and you take more because you're desperate for relief. That's not moral failure. That's not character weakness. That's physiology. That's what happens to bodies under long-term medical treatment. We see this every single day in hospitals, in pain management clinics, in palliative care, in oncology wards where cancer patients need increasingly higher doses of opioids to manage their pain. And when we see it there, we call those patients brave. We call them fighters. We recognize that they're dealing with something incredibly difficult and that managing chronic conditions with powerful medications is complicated and messy and doesn't always go perfectly. But when it's Elvis, when it's someone famous, when it's someone we've decided fits a narrative we already believe, we call him an addict. We reduce his entire medical reality to drug habits that speak for themselves. We ignore the clinical definitions. We ignore the distinction between compulsive, destructive addiction and physiological dependency under medical care. We ignore the fact that what he was experiencing is what millions of chronic pain patients experience every single day. And here's what makes this especially infuriating. The same people who will show compassion for a cancer patient struggling with pain medication, the same people who understand that long-term pharmaceutical treatment is complex and imperfect, will turn around and call Elvis a junkie. Why? Because it's easier. Because the addiction narrative is simpler. Because we'd rather believe in moral failure than deal with the complicated reality of chronic illness and the limitations of medical care. Elvis was a man with legitimate medical conditions trying to function under impossible pressure. The touring, the performing, the expectations, the lack of privacy, the constant demands. And he was trying to manage it with the tools available to him in the 1970s, which meant prescription medications, which meant working with doctors, which meant developing tolerance and dependency over time. Was it perfect? Were there times when he made poor decisions? Absolutely. Were there moments when his judgment was impaired and he took more than he should have? Yes, and that's what happens when you're dealing with chronic conditions and pharmaceutical dependency. That's the messy reality of long-term medical treatment. But it doesn't make him an addict. It makes him a patient, a person who was suffering, a person who was trying to survive. And to label him an addict, to use that word so carelessly, so confidently, without understanding what it actually means, that's not just factually wrong. That's an insult to Elvis. It's an insult to every chronic pain patient who's ever been judged for needing help. And it's a perfect example of how we'd rather cling to simple narratives than deal with complicated truths. Elvis's drug use doesn't speak for itself. It speaks to a medical tragedy, to the limits of 1970s pain management, to the impossible position of being a chronic pain patient in the public eye. And it's time we started talking about it honestly. And now we need to talk about something that goes beyond factual disputes, beyond who was where and when, beyond medical definitions and diagnostic criteria. We need to talk about basic human decency and what happens when people forget it. In that same broadcast where Danny Smith claimed Donna wasn't there a lot, he said something else. Something that crossed a line from disagreement into disrespect, from revisionist history into outright character assassination. He claimed that Delta Presley, Donna's aunt, a respected elder member of the Presley family, had a crush on Al Strada, a younger man, a member of Elvis's staff. Let me say that again, so the absurdity of it fully lands. Delta Presley, a mature woman, a woman of dignity, a woman who was old enough to be Al Strada's mother, supposedly harbored some kind of romantic infatuation toward a younger staff member. And this is being said casually, like it's a fun bit of gossip, like it's a harmless anecdote to spice up the conversation. It's not harmless, and it's not true. Delta Presley was Donna's mother's sister. She was a woman who understood loyalty, who understood family, who understood her role and her place within the Presley household. She wasn't some starstruck teenager giggling over boys. She wasn't prone to foolish behavior or idle fantasy. She wasn't the kind of woman who lost her dignity over a crush. Anyone who actually knew Delta, not just existed in the same space as her, but truly knew her, would understand how ridiculous this claim is. She was a woman of substance, forthright, protective of her family, not someone inclined toward gossip or romantic daydreaming. And the age difference alone should make this claim laughable. She was old enough to be his mother. The idea that she was harboring some secret crush, some romantic longing toward a younger man on staff, is not just implausible. It's insulting. But here's what makes this particularly disturbing. Delta Presley is dead. She died years ago. She can't defend herself. She can't set the record straight. She can't stand up and say, "That's not who I was. That's not what happened." So someone who claims to have known her, who claims to have been around during those years, takes the memory of an elder family member and turns it into entertainment, into gossip, into a punchline. For what? For views, for credibility, to make the story more interesting. There's a word for that, and the word is disrespectful. When you take someone who can't speak for themselves, someone who lived their life with dignity and purpose, and you reduce them to cheap speculation, you're not preserving history. You're distorting it. You're not honoring their memory, you're degrading it. And for what? So people can have something to laugh about. So the story has a little more spice. So you can position yourself as someone who knows the real, inside details. That's not history, that's gossip, and there's a massive difference between the two. History is based on fact, on documentation, on credible testimony from people who were actually there and have a reason to tell the truth. Gossip is based on hearsay, on speculation, on rumor and innuendo that gets passed around until it sounds like fact simply because it's been repeated enough times. And when you turn an elder family member, a woman who spent her life being loyal and protective, into gossip, you're not just wrong about the facts. You're wrong morally. Delta Presley deserves to be remembered for who she actually was, not for some fabricated romantic subplot that makes the story more entertaining. She was loyal, she was forthright, she was protective of her family. She understood what it meant to be part of the Presley household during some of its most difficult years. She wasn't perfect, no one is, but she was dignified, and she deserves to be remembered that way. Not as some lovesick woman pinning after a younger man, not as a character in someone else's anecdote, not as a punchline to make a broadcast more interesting. She deserves better than that, and so does every other family member who can't defend themselves anymore. Because here's the thing about legacy, about memory, about the stories we tell after people are gone. We have a responsibility, not just to get the facts right, though that matters, but to approach people's lives with respect, with dignity, with the understanding that these were real human beings with real feelings and real families who are still here, still listening, still impacted by what gets said. When you make up stories about the dead, you're not just lying about them. You're hurting the people who loved them, the people who remember them as they actually were. Donna remembers her Aunt Delta, not as gossip material, not as a romantic subplot, but as a real person, a family member, someone who mattered. And to hear that person reduced to a joke, to a baseless, absurd claim about a crush, that's not just factually wrong. That's cruel. So let's be clear about something. There was no crush. There was no romantic infatuation. There was no inappropriate longing from a mature woman toward a younger staff member. There was just Delta Presley, a woman doing her best, a woman being part of a complicated family during complicated times, a woman who deserves to be remembered accurately. And if you can't remember her accurately, if you can't honor her memory with the truth, then maybe you shouldn't be speaking about her at all. Because that's the difference between testimony and entertainment, between preserving history and distorting it for clicks. Testimony matters when it rests on fact, when it comes from people who were actually there, when it's told with integrity and respect for the people involved. Everything else is just noise. And Delta Presley, along with every other member of the Presley family who can't defend themselves anymore, deserves better than noise. She deserves the truth, and the truth is simple. She was a woman of dignity, and she should be remembered that way. Not as gossip, not as entertainment, but as she was. Loyal, protective, real. Testimony only matters when it rests on fact. Donna Presley's does, and that leaves nothing left to dispute. If you believe truth matters more than entertainment, drop a comment below. Subscribe if you want stories told with integrity, not just shock value. Because the real story of Graceland isn't about who was seen, it's about who was actually there. And now you know.